Hi everyone, and welcome to User Retention Bootcamp. Thanks so much for joining us today. We're excited to discuss how you can build a product that retains users and how you can develop retention strategies for any stage of business. This is the first class in our three-part series, and today we'll be covering how to set a foundation for a sticky product. We'll be introducing some key concepts about retention and laying the groundwork for the next two classes. My name is Alicia, and I'm on the growth marketing team here at Amplitude. If you aren't familiar with Amplitude yet, it's a product analytics platform that helps teams understand user behavior in mobile and web and really any digital product. Product and growth teams use Amplitude to react quickly to customer needs, ship product quickly, and ultimately build better products. Now, before we get started, I do want to point out a few things that are in the webinar console that you're looking at. Throughout the session, you can use the Q&A box to ask any questions that come up during our class. We'll be responding to your questions throughout the session, and we'll also have some time at the end to use the chat window for Q&A. You can also join the conversation on Twitter to ask any questions or share what you're learning. Just make sure that you use the hashtag Retention Bootcamp, and make sure to mention us at Amplitude Mobile so that we see your messages. And in the console, you'll also see a resources window where we have a few different resources that you can download, and I'll also point those out during the class. These will be really helpful for you to work through on your own or reference afterwards. And just to put today's class in context, here's the full class schedule for the User Retention Bootcamp. Make sure that you sign up for the next two sessions if you haven't already, because they're going to build on what we covered today. All right, that covers all the logistics, so let's get started. Here's an overview of what we're going to cover in today's session. First, we'll talk about why retention is so important for any business. Then, we'll provide you with the tools and the knowledge that you need to define two key metrics for understanding user retention. These are your critical event and your product usage interval. Third, we'll introduce the Retention Lifecycle framework and how to pick the best retention metrics that fit your product or your business. And by the end of the session, you'll be ready to get a baseline of your retention metrics so that you can dig deeper into retention strategies in the next two sessions of this bootcamp. So let's start with talking about why retention matters. If you're working on a mobile app, this is probably a stat that you've seen a lot, that you're competing with over 4 million other mobile apps, and that number is just growing every single day. And it's not only mobile. The market for SaaS products, e-commerce, media, and other web apps is equally crowded right now. The internet currently has over 3 billion users across the globe, and that number is increasing steadily by 10% year over year. This easier access to the internet means that people are using digital products across desktop and mobile devices more than ever. Unfortunately, that also means that it's only getting harder for companies to stand out from the competition and keep users interested in their product. This really crowded and competitive space means that it's getting increasingly difficult to get people's attention and attract new users to your product. However, getting someone to start using your product is really only the beginning. You can pour a lot of money into attracting users, but that's not enough to build a sustainable customer base. In fact, we actually did a study of over 500 million mobile devices, and we found that 80% of users actually stop using the average app just 3 days after downloading it. And this doesn't apply only to mobile apps. It applies to any digital product, whether you're a B2B SaaS company, working in consumer tech, or media, or e-commerce. If you don't demonstrate value to your users early and often and turn them into habitual users, people will end up leaving your product for a competitor that's meeting their needs better. Filling the top of your funnel really doesn't matter if your product is effectively a leaky bucket. Long-term growth, as well as the health of your business, depends on how well you retain your users. That's how you're going to demonstrate that your product has real value. So, how do you go about building a product that's not only capable of acquiring users, but also keeping them around long-term? In other words, how do you sustain real growth? It all starts with understanding that retention is the most critical metric when it comes to building a successful product. Now, the most basic definition of retention is that it's a measure of how many users return to your product over time. Even the best products are going to lose some percentage of their users within the first few days. But if you make retention your primary product metric, you can change the trajectory of your company from one that stalls or loses users over time to one that sustains true growth. Increasing user retention and minimizing churn is the key to building a base of loyal, engaged users and driving sustainable growth. A business that retains its users is going to end up increasing its revenue and becoming profitable much faster than one that has lower retention. And in the end, retention really impacts every important business metric that you care about, whether that's revenue or monthly active users, engagement, customer lifetime value, or payback period. All of these metrics are going to get driven up if you're driving up retention. So what is retention exactly? There are a few different methods to calculate retention, which I'm going to cover later in this session. But right now, I'll just give a brief definition. And the industry standard that's used most frequently is what we call end-day retention. A really good way of visualizing retention rate is actually by plotting a retention curve, as you can see on the slide right now. So with the retention curve, you can see what percentage of your new users are returning over time and how sharp that drop-off over time is. When you're measuring end-day retention, day 0 on the graph refers to the first day on which a new user is using your product. So this could be the day that they install your mobile app or create an account. Then retention on each day after that is calculated as the percentage of users who started on day 0, who then returned and were active on that day N later. So for example, in this graph that we're looking at, if you take a look at the blue curve, on day 10, the retention is right around 50%. So what that means is that for this product, about 50% of new users who start on day 0 return to this product on exactly day 10 after first using the product. Another thing you can see in this graph is that the curves flatten out after around day 22. And a retention curve flattening out is a really good sign because it means that after an initial drop-off of new users during the first few weeks on this curve, this product is then maintaining a steady base of about 35% of their new users. If on the other hand you see a retention curve that keeps declining and never really flattens out, that means that product probably hasn't found a good product market fit yet, and it's not able to maintain some baseline of active users, which is really important. All right, so when should you focus on retention? A common misconception about retention is that it only matters after your company is past a certain stage of growth. In reality, once you have a base amount of users coming back to your product on a regular basis, you have enough information to begin optimizing your product for retention. Now, keep in mind that the way you approach your retention may change over time, but what doesn't change is the fact that only products that constantly improve their retention rates can remain sustainable over time. In fact, you should probably be thinking about retention as early as possible, even before you launch a new product. If your product doesn't naturally have a way built in to encourage users to come back over time, there's no point yet in spending the time and money to acquire new users who are just going to end up churning. Now, the big takeaway here is that it's never too early to think about retention, although the approach will be different depending on whether you're pre-launch versus a well-established product with a good base of users. I also want to point out that diagnosing and improving your retention should be an ongoing process at all stages of growth. As you iterate on your product experience, in order to develop a more habit-forming, sticky product, you have to always be keeping an eye on and improving retention. And while there is no magic formula that's going to magically improve your retention, User Retention Bootcamp's goal is to provide you with a framework to diagnose your product's retention and develop strategies to improve it over time. The team here at Amplitude, we actually developed this retention framework by working with 8 of our customers who are all at different stages of growth and in different industries. So by working with them and diving into their own user behavior data, we were able to validate the principles of this framework that I'm going to share with you, as well as really validate all the methods that we used. And we actually found real insights and recommendations for improving all of these companies' retention. And now we're excited in this bootcamp and through the playbook to share all of what we learned with you. So before I dive into the Retention Lifecycle framework, I do want to go over 3 different ways that you can calculate user retention. The best method of calculation for you is going to depend on the type of product that you have and how your user base naturally behaves. If you're currently using an analytics platform that calculates retention for you, it's going to be important to make sure that you know exactly how it's being defined and whether that's actually suitable for your product. And you should end up choosing the method that is the most relevant to your business and will be the most useful to you in helping you to make better decisions. All right, so as I mentioned earlier, when most people discuss retention metrics, they're actually talking about what we call end-day retention. End-day retention measures the proportion of users who are active in your product on a specific day after first use. It's really well suited for things like gaming apps, social networking, or any other type of product where you're trying to get users to exhibit regular, repeated, daily behavior. Remember, the day a user is first active in your product is designated day 0. This is probably the day that they first download your app or the day that they register. And then any day after that, you look at the percentage of users who came back on exactly that day. So for example, day 7 retention for end day retention is going to be the percentage of users who came back exactly on day 7. So users will only get counted if they come back exactly on that day. The next method that I'm going to introduce is what we call unbounded retention. So this is a little bit different. It actually measures the proportion of users who came back on a specific day or any time after that day. So this type of analysis can be a better fit than end-day retention if your business doesn't necessarily expect users to come back and engage with your product or service on a really regular cadence. So for example, let's say that you have an on-demand delivery service. End-day retention might not actually be a very useful metric for you in that case because you don't need to know whether a new user returned on exactly the 7th day after they signed up. However, you might be more interested in knowing what percentage of users are returning at some point after their first week. And that's what unbounded retention would help you measure. So for example, day 7 retention for unbounded retention would give you the percentage of users who came back on day 7 or any day after that. So it would include counting users who came back on day 8 or day 10 or day 20 or any day after day 7. All of those users will get counted in that percentage that's on the day 7 unbounded metric. All right, and the last retention calculation method that we're going to talk about today is bracket retention. You can think of bracket retention as a more flexible and nuanced version of end-day retention. It lets you split up your retention analysis into custom time periods that you define instead of limiting yourself to set daily, weekly, or monthly timeframes. This is the most customizable method, so it's really good for if you already understand your users to a certain extent and have a good sense of their expected usage patterns. Then you can begin to use bracket retention and define your own custom intervals of multiple days, weeks, or months. So one example that I'll talk about is Pinterest. They use a retention metric that they call 1D7 to measure the activation of their new users. So this metric looks at the proportion of new users who started on day 0 who then return to Pinterest anytime between days 1 and day 7. So their first bracket is day 0, and then their second bracket is day 1 through 7. And then they also look at retention of these users in the day 28 to day 35 bracket in order to show what percentage of new users are still active 1 month after sign up. All right. So the right retention metric for you is going to show you where you can improve, and it's going to give you an accurate view of the health of your business. Figuring out which type of retention to use is heavily dependent on how frequently you expect people to use your product. If you expect people to come back on a regular basis, like daily for a mobile game or weekly for an exercise app, then end-day retention is probably a better fit for you. But if you notice that many of your users don't actually have a steady usage pattern, for example, a food delivery app where people place orders kind of sporadically, then unbounded retention might provide a more accurate measure of how your business is doing. If you're just starting out, we recommend trying to measure your retention via a few of these different methods, and then you can kind of see which one seems to be giving you the most meaningful information and which one seems to fit the natural usage pattern of your users. And you can calculate any of these methods kind of on your own. As I mentioned, end-day retention is probably the most common one that out-of-the-box analytics platforms are going to offer. And if you're using Amplitude's enterprise plan, in the retention chart, you can actually toggle between using these different methods of retention to calculate that metric. All right, so now that we've gone over the 3 methods of calculating retention, it's time to start getting into the retention lifecycle framework. All right, so far we've covered why retention matters, when to think about it, and 3 different ways to calculate it. Now we're going to talk about 2 key metrics that you're going to need to define for your product in order to effectively develop retention strategies. The first thing that's important to define is your critical event. A critical event is an action that users take within your product that aligns closely with your core value proposition. Put another way, when you're measuring retention, the critical event is going to describe the action that you want users to perform in order to be counted as truly active or retained. You don't necessarily want to count a user as active if the only thing that they do is open your app and then leave without doing anything. There's probably some other important action that you'd like to see them do. You can see a few examples here on this slide. So a mindfulness app that provides self-guided meditations might decide that completing a meditation session is their critical event. For a site that helps users find and book fitness classes, successfully booking a class is the critical event. And for a mobile gaming company, the critical event would be completing a game. Now, chances are that you probably already know what your critical event is, because it's just going to be whatever that main action is that you want to drive your users toward and get them to perform. Now, if you still want some guidance helping decide what your critical event should be, here are a few questions that you can ask yourself to help clarify that. The first one is, what is the one action that you want a user to do every time they use your product? If you had to pick just one really important thing that gets at the core of your product, what is it? The second one is, what metrics do you care about as a company? And then which numbers are you ultimately trying to drive up, and which user actions can end up being tied to that metric? So that metric might be revenue, it could be number of new subscriptions or trial conversions, or if it's a more viral product, it might be the number of people that users refer. So you want to think about what are the actions that are ultimately tied to that metric that you care about. And then lastly, if you're managing multiple products or have very different user personas, then you're going to need to think about different metrics for each one. So one example might be if you have like a 2-sided marketplace. So for example, something like Uber, they have both the drivers that they care about as kind of one user group of their product, as well as people who are ordering rides. And so they're going to need to think about retention and about critical events differently for those 2 groups of users. All right, so now that we've covered critical events, the second important metric to determine is your product usage interval. Basically, the product usage interval describes how often you expect people to naturally use your product. Now, you probably understand intuitively, right, that not all products are meant to be used with the same frequency. Some products are built to be used daily, like a social app or something media or casual gaming. But other products, like an on-demand or an e-commerce or an expense reporting software, would be used a lot less frequently. So the product usage interval is an important concept for helping you get an accurate and meaningful measure of user retention. If your product is only meant to be used once or twice a month, you don't want to be using daily retention to try to benchmark your user retention, because then it'll seem really low when in reality you might have a pretty healthy product. So how do you figure out what your product usage interval is? You probably already have some idea based off of your own intuition and experience with how people use your product. But if you don't worry about it. you can just follow these few steps that we have to use your existing user behavior data to help you determine your product's usage interval. Basically, you just want to measure how long it takes users to repeat your critical event. If the average user repeats the critical event within 1 day, then you would have a daily usage interval. And if it takes the average user about a week to repeat the critical event, then you'd have a weekly usage interval. So you can do this by plotting a curve with the cumulative proportion of users who repeated the critical event within different time intervals. So for example, if you take a look at the chart that's on the slide, you can see that the critical event being measured is when a user plays a song or a video. The curve is then plotting the percentage of users who repeat this critical event within 1 day, within 2 days, and so on. You can then estimate your usage interval by locating the inflection point of this curve, which in this case is around 4 days. So what that means is that for this product, you expect the typical user to return and play another song or video within 4 days. Now, if you're already using Amplitude's Enterprise plan, you can actually view this usage interval graph on the retention chart. However, it's pretty easy for you to make this type of graph yourself as long as you are tracking user behavior data for your critical event. Now, to help you calculate your own product usage interval, we've actually created an interactive worksheet that you can use, and you can download that worksheet in the resources widget in the webinar console. Okay. So now that we've covered the 3 methods of calculating retention, as well as how to determine your critical event and your product usage interval, we're ready to get into the meat of the retention lifecycle framework. Again, here's our general retention curve showing the percentage of users returning over time. But there's actually a major problem with this graph. It's lumping together a lot of different types of users into one single curve. In reality, not all active users are created equal. In order for you to make meaningful, long-term improvements to your retention, you need to understand your active users as they flow through different stages of being retained. Now, the way that we think about analyzing retention and putting strategies in place to improve it should change depending on what stage a user is at in their own product journey. At Amplitude, we think of active users in 3 different stages of retention: new, current, and resurrected. This is what we call the retention lifecycle, and it's the foundation of how we think about understanding retention for users who are at different stages in the lifecycle. At any point in time, if you took a look at all of your active users, they could be divided into 3 main buckets: new users, current users, and resurrected users. And then you also have your churned users, who are people who have stopped using your product. Now, the way that we define these is that new users, pretty self-explanatory, are people who are using your product for the very first time. And current users are people who have already been using your product consistently for some amount of time. Whereas resurrected users are people who were active, and then they had a period of inactivity when they weren't using you, and then for some reason they've come back and are actively engaging again. And then churned users, of course, are people who used to use your product but aren't anymore. Breaking out these different cohorts of users is going to help you identify better retention strategies that are tailored for each group, rather than if you just tried to hit them all with the same strategies. In the lifecycle diagram on the right, you can see that the arrows are showing how users flow between the different stages of the retention lifecycle. Our goals that we're going to present in the rest of this bootcamp are going to be to get new users and resurrected users to become current users, as well as to figure out how we can get churned users to resurrect. And then we'll also talk about some strategies to get current users to become even more engaged power users of your product. So why are all of these lifecycle stages so important? The problem is that a lot of products focus only on new users without thinking about strategies for current and resurrected users. So this can result in a focus on artificially increasing their active user counts through simply acquiring new users. Now, of course, top of the funnel is important because you can't attract new users if you don't have anyone to retain, but the growth of your current and your resurrected user base is what really matters for true growth. So let's look at an example of how this plays out. Here we have a graph showing the total number of active users for a certain product over the course of 12 weeks. You can see that the product grew from having about 6 million active users to over 8 million active users by week 12. So things seem to be going pretty well. But now let's look at what this graph looks like when we break the active users up into the 3 buckets that we talked about: new, current, and resurrected users. Here we have new users in dark green, current users in light green, and resurrected users in blue. And then the red bar that's negative is also showing the number of users who have churned out each week. So you can see that the majority of active users are actually made up of brand new users, the dark green bar, each week. And while the number of new users each week is going up, the number of current users in light green is actually decreasing over time, which means that this product is losing the vast majority of its users to churn. There's also only a very small number of users who are resurrecting each week. So in other words, once you break up the graph this way, you can see that even though the active user count is going up each week, the product is not actually growing over time. Breaking down your active user base into new, current, and resurrected users is going to show you whether or not your product is experiencing true growth. For a more healthy lifecycle chart, you would want to see the bar for current users growing steadily over time, and you probably wouldn't want to see new users making up the vast majority of your active users. You would want it to be a smaller proportion. So here's our retention lifecycle again. In the next class of this webinar series, we're going to discuss strategies for moving each of these types of users in the direction that we want. So we're going to talk about how to get new users to become current users, how to get resurrected users to become current users, how to keep your current users, and how to even convert some of them into more engaged power users, and of course, how to get churned or inactive users to reactivate and become resurrected users that you can re-engage with. So in order to do this, the first step that we have to do is create cohorts of each of these types of users so that you can then perform different types of analysis on them. You can use the definitions that we have on this slide to help you create these user cohorts. Remember, this is where we're going to apply that product usage interval that you defined earlier in the class. So your product usage interval determines how long each phase of the life cycle is for your user base. So for example, if you have a product with a weekly usage interval, then that means that new users are going to be any users who are in their very first week of using your product. And then current users will be people who were active in the previous week and are active in the current week. Resurrected users are going to be people who were inactive for at least a full week, again, using your product usage interval, so people who were inactive for at least a full week and have now reactivated in your product. And then churned users are going to be defined as people who have not used your product for at least a whole week and have not returned yet in the current time period that you're measuring. So depending on what analytic system you're currently using, you can define these cohorts within that analytic software, or if you're using some kind of raw data, you could define them using SQL or some other query language. And if you do happen to be using Amplitude on the enterprise plan, you can create these cohorts really easily with just a few clicks from our lifecycle chart, and then you'll have those cohorts ready to do the further steps of the analysis in the next class. And then once you've created your cohorts, you can see what the percentage of your active users looks like for each stage of the life cycle. So here are a couple of examples from 2 different products. Creating a table like this is going to help give you an idea of where your strengths and weaknesses are. So if you look at product A, 70% of the active users in the time period are new users, which is pretty high. It's kind of similar to that other graph that we looked at earlier. For the product to grow sustainably, this company needs to make sure that they're retaining new users well so that they can grow their current user base every period and not only focus on acquiring new users. You can also see that product A has pretty high churn relative to their total active users. While they definitely want to reduce that churn, this is also a large base of users that they can potentially resurrect. So it does mean that they have this base of people that, they already have their contact information, these people have already engaged with them at some time, And so these might be good candidates for re-engaging and trying to get these people to become current users again. If you take a look at product B, it has a much healthier distribution of active users. Almost 70% of their users are current users who were active in the previous period, and their churn is pretty low relative to the total number of active users. A company with a distribution like this already has pretty good retention and can put more efforts behind top of funnel to drive more new users and accelerate growth. We recommend creating a table like this for your own product so that you can get a sense of your product's health when it comes to the retention lifecycle. Graphing how these percentages change over time will help you measure whether your retention strategies are effective. All right, so that pretty much wraps it up for this session. Our goal in this webinar was to introduce different ways to analyze retention, as well as introduce you to the retention lifecycle framework. Whichever retention analysis you choose for your business, the framework remains the same. First, get a deep understanding of how users retain at each stage of their lifecycle, and then put in place strategies to turn your active users into highly engaged current users. Once you've created your cohorts of new, current, and resurrected users, you're ready for the second class of this webinar series, when we'll go through some retention strategies for each cohort in the lifecycle. If you haven't already, make sure that you sign up for the next 2 classes in our bootcamp series. These webinars are happening live on the dates shown on the slide, but they'll also be available on demand after that date as well. Now, as I mentioned, our next session is going to cover retention strategies across every stage in the lifecycle. And then our third session is going to be a little bit more practical and tactical. So we're going to cover the best way for you to set up your event tracking taxonomy so that you can actually measure user behavior really effectively, and how to prioritize some of the different retention strategies that you'll come up with in the second class. Also, I want to mention that the majority of the material that we're covering in these 3 sessions is in this book, Volume 1 of the Product Analytics Playbook, which is a resource that the team at Amplitude put together covering everything that we've learned so far about user retention. It goes a lot more in depth into the concepts that we covered today and can also give you a little bit more of a step-by-step guide on the methods that you can follow. So I definitely recommend that you download the PDF version of this guide in the resources widget on your webinar console. All right, so that's a wrap on class number 1 on setting the foundation for a sticky product. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'll be sticking around on the chat widget for a few more minutes to answer any questions that you have. And if you're signing off, thank you again so much for joining, and we're looking forward to seeing you at the next class. And if you're sticking around for Q&A, just feel free to continue using that chat box to enter your questions. Thanks so much.